Hey there, and welcome back to ClearPath Conversations. I'm Mark Bernardin. In the last episode, we introduced the Program Resiliency Plan, the PRP. We talked about the distinction between measuring activity and measuring survivability. We covered the gating condition, the 4 dimensions of resiliency, and why the weakest dimension determines priority rather than averaging scores just across the board. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, go back and start there. This episode builds directly on that foundation. Today, we're going operational. We're talking about how you actually run the PRP, not the concept, the execution, the 30-day cycle, the ownership model, the decision impact on your forecast and expansion plans, and what it looks like to run this framework under real-world conditions, which are never as clean as any model assumes. Let's start with the execution structure, because this is where the PRP either becomes a useful tool or turns into another document that gets created and forgotten. The PRP operates on a 30-day cycle with 3 phases: diagnose, act, and validate. The diagnose phase is the shortest, typically the first 3 days of the cycle. This is not an extended assessment. It's a focused identification of the weakest dimension and its root cause. The whole point is the whole point of keeping this phase short is to prevent the analysis from becoming the work. I've seen teams spend 3 weeks building a perfect picture of what's wrong while the account continues to deteriorate. I call this admiring the problem. The diagnose phase forces a decision quickly: which dimension is the most vulnerable and why. You're not trying to resolve everything you find in diagnose. You're identifying the one thing that most threatens the account's structural integrity and confirming your understanding of why it exists. Now, that's the input for the next phase. The act phase runs from roughly day 4 through day 25. This is where the targeted work happens. And I want to emphasize the word targeted, because the temptation here is to address everything you identified in the assessment. Don't. The PRP is not a comprehensive remediation plan. It concentrates effort on the weakest dimension. The reasoning is simple. If relationship density is your critical vulnerability, improving narrative strength and services stability won't save the account if a key stakeholder leaves and there's nobody else engaged. You have to fix the structural failure first. Everything else is noise until that's done. Each dimension has a corresponding set of actions in the act phase. If relationship density is a problem, your energy goes into stakeholder expansion, identifying who else in the organization needs to be in the relationship, building a deliberate outreach strategy, and getting your sales counterpart involved to support executive access. If narrative strength is a problem, you're doing the work to rebuild the value narrative, not just refreshing the slide deck, but facilitating conversations where the customer develops and articulates the value story in their own terms. If structural risk signals are present, you escalate. You don't manage a structural risk signal quietly on your own. If services stability is degrading, you work with your implementation and your support teams, and you do it immediately to correct it. The critical discipline in the act phase is focus. You're not trying to improve the whole account. You're trying to move one dimension from unstable to stable. That constraint is what makes the 30-day cycle achievable. The validate phase happens in the final 5 days of the cycle, roughly days 26 through 30. And here's something that I want you to hear clearly. Validation is not internal. You do not validate progress by reviewing your own notes, updating your CRM fields, or deciding on your own that things have improved. Validation is confirmed externally. It happens in a conversation at the executive or senior leadership level where the customer demonstrates the change. That means stronger alignment, clearer value articulation, reduced risk signal intensity. And you're observing evidence of that, not asserting it. Now, why does this matter? Because CSMs are optimistic by nature. We want accounts to be healthy. We want to see progress. And without an external confirmation requirement, we start measuring progress against our own expectations, which are influenced by the work that we've put in rather than the actual state of the account. External validation corrects for that bias. If the customer can't demonstrate the change in a structured conversation with their own senior stakeholders present, the dimension hasn't stabilized. If validate confirms stability, you assess whether all 4 dimensions now meet the minimum viable resiliency threshold. If they do, the PRP closes and the account returns to standard engagement. If one dimension is improving but not yet stable, the cycle continues for another 30 days. If 2 consecutive cycles fail to produce improvement, the account is reclassified as a recovery scenario and a different motion begins. That reclassification rule is important. 2 consecutive failed cycles is not a judgment. It's a factual determination that the account has moved beyond what the PRP is designed to address. At that point, it needs recovery work, the kind we covered back in episodes 7 and 8. Not another round of resiliency assessment. Now let me talk about what the PRP does to the ownership model, because this is one of the things that distinguishes it from a standard customer success account plan. When the PRP is active, the account becomes a shared priority. The CSM initiates and orchestrates. That doesn't change, but the account is no longer something you're managing on your own with periodic check-ins from your team. Sales is accountable for supporting stakeholder expansion and executive access. You can't build executive relationships without their involvement, and the PRP makes that explicit. Services and support are accountable for delivery stability. If services stability is a vulnerable dimension, they're not optional participants. Leadership is responsible for visibility and escalation authority when structural risk signals are present. The PRP is not a coordination request. It's a signal that revenue is at elevated risk and that cross-functional participation is required, and it's not optional. That's a meaningfully different posture than the typical ask for help. And this is where the PRP can create internal friction, which is worth being honest about. Not every team operates with that level of urgency around a CS concern that isn't yet a formal, at-risk account. What I found is that the most effective way to activate cross-functional participation is to make the revenue consequence visible before you're making the ask. When people understand that a specific structural weakness left unaddressed translates to forecast risk on a specific account with a specific ARR value, the conversation changes. It's no longer a CS problem. It's a business problem. If cross-functional participation doesn't materialize when the PRP is active, that gap must be escalated. This is not a situation where you compensate quietly by doing more yourself. A CSM who absorbs what should be a shared accountability is hiding a systemic problem. Escalation isn't failure. It's the mechanism by which the organization learns what it needs to function. The PRP also changes how the business should evaluate the account. This is what I call decision impact, and it's one of the most important aspects of the framework. When narrative strength is weak, renewal confidence should be adjusted. If the customer can't articulate value independently, the likelihood of a clean, no friction renewal conversation is lower than it would appear. That should be reflected in how the account is treated in the forecast. When relationship density is limited, when you have a single-threaded account, expansion should pause until that's resolved. I mean that literally. You should not be advancing expansion pipeline on an account that depends on one person, because the expansion is built on the same fragile foundation as the base relationship. If that person leaves, you lose both. When active structural risk signals are present, the account's commit status should be reviewed. This is a conversation with leadership, not a solo judgment call. When services stability is degrading, that has to be corrected immediately, and it may affect renewal timing or commercial posture if it isn't. The PRP exists in part to correct false confidence in forecast and expansion data. Most enterprise customer success portfolios have accounts that are overstated in the forecast. Not because anyone's being dishonest, but because the traditional metrics they don't surface the structural weaknesses that'll affect outcomes. The PRP does. And when it does, the business needs to respond to that information rather than just ignore it. Now, I mentioned the minimum viable resiliency. Let me talk about what minimum viable resiliency actually means, because it's the exit condition for the PRP, and it's worth being precise about. Minimum viable resiliency is not it's not a perfect account. It's a structurally stable one. Four conditions must all be true to close the PRP. Multiple stakeholders are engaged across the relationship. Not just multiple names on a contact list, but genuinely involved stakeholders who would show up and remain engaged if your primary contact left tomorrow. The customer can articulate value tied to a current business priority, and more than one person on their side can tell that story. No high severity structural risks remain unsolved. Delivery is stable and consistent. There's also a disruption test. Ask yourself, if a key stakeholder leaves or the customer's priorities shift in the next 30 days, does the account hold? If the honest answer is no, if you'd be back in emergency mode, then minimum viable resiliency hasn't been achieved, regardless of how any individual dimension is scored. This test matters because it's the actual question the PRP is designed to answer. Not did we improve things, but would this account survive a disruption? That's the standard. I want to address real world execution directly because I've built this framework with the constraints of an actual enterprise CSM job in mind, not an idealized version of it. Most CSMs carry portfolios of anywhere from 15 to 30 accounts. Most don't have dedicated program resources. Most operate in organizations where cross-functional alignment is aspirational rather than automatic. The PRP was designed for those conditions. You can begin the PRP with a CSM alone if necessary. The gating condition, the dimension assessment, and the diagnose phase do not require cross-functional participation to start. But the act phase does. And if you can't get participation there, you escalate. That's not a workaround. It's the intended escalation path. The 30-day cycle is also forgiving of imperfect conditions. Accounts don't cooperate with calendar deadlines. They don't care. Stakeholders go on vacation. Escalations happen on other accounts at really inconvenient times. The cycle's a structure, not a rigid timer. What it enforces is the sequence. Diagnose before you act. Validate externally before you declare progress. Not an immovable 30-day countdown. The PRP is also designed to integrate with your existing account rhythms. It's not a separate process layered on top of everything else you do. The validate phase happens in an executive business review or a leadership conversation that you're having anyway. The diagnose phase is the informed version of the account assessment that you're doing before every quarterly planning cycle. The act phase actions are the structured, prioritized version of the work that you'd be doing regardless. The PRP gives that work a framework and a discipline. It doesn't create entirely new work. And one more thing before we close. And this is about how the PRP interacts with forecasting on the portfolio level. When you run the PRP systematically, applying it to quarterly to accounts that show early instability signals, not just when something is obviously wrong, it changes the quality of your forecast data over time. You start to develop a clearer picture of which accounts are genuinely stable versus which ones look stable because the signals haven't turned obvious yet. I've run portfolios worth over 8.5 million in ARR, and the discipline that made the most consistent difference in forecast accuracy wasn't better tooling or more frequent check-ins. It was building a practice of evaluating structural integrity as a separate, deliberate activity from performance monitoring. The PRP is that practice in a repeatable form. When your leadership can trust that your forecast reflects structural reality, not just activity data, the credibility of your judgment increases across the board. And that credibility is what gives you the organizational standing to activate the resources you need when an account actually needs them. Now, in our next episode, we are going to draw a direct comparison between the PRP and the account success plan, because I know it's something you were thinking. Do I need both? Does the PRP replace the success plan? How do they work together? And when does each one apply? Those are all fair questions. And the answer has real implications for how you manage your portfolio. And that's what we'll be covering in our next episode. The PRP worksheet is available at clearpathcx.com. It walks you through every step that we discussed today: the activation trigger, the gating condition, the dimension assessment, the 30-day execution plan, and the minimum viable resiliency check. If you have an account in mind while listening to this, you can run through the worksheet start to finish in about an hour. Now, follow the show on your favorite platform. Connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Mark Bernardin. And if you've tried the PRP on an account and want to share what you found, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Drop me a line. So thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this work. And thank you for showing up and delivering every single day. I'll talk to you soon.